Blake and Christina were surprised at Keith's tone. As far as they remembered, he'd always been a bit of a wallflower in the past, especially when he came across Blake. After all, even the biggest jocks in the school hadn't dared to mess with a Carrington. But now, Keith seemed to be a completely different man. His tone was indifferent, and his eyes showed a mysterious calm. Blake even noticed a flicker of disrespect in Keith's eyes, and it made his blood boil. He sneered. "I haven't seen you in more than 6 months. You sure have changed. You think you're some kind of hotshot now, just because you got a job shuffling papers at the precinct?" Blake snorted. "Well, let me tell you something, Sanderberg. Trash will always be trash. I could click my fingers and have you thrown out by the police like that. So don't take yourself so seriously." Seeing that Blake was getting angry with Keith, Christina quickly spoke up. "Blake, forget it. He's not worth it. He's not part of our lives anymore, so don't worry. Let's go." Her words quelled Blake's anger a little, but when he looked back, Keith was still watching him silently. Seeing Keith's unbothered expression, Blake said mockingly, "So, you're still a coward, huh?" Looking pleased with himself, he continued, "For Christina's sake, I'm not going to argue with a piece of crap like you. Just get the hell out of my way." Before Blake could say anything more, a crisp sound echoed through the garden. Keith had stepped forward and hit him. Blake tumbled to the ground, clutching his cheek, as Christina hovered beside him. They were both equally shocked. The gardens fell deadly silent. Keith looked at Blake innocently and said, "Oh, sorry. I heard a mosquito buzzing around my ear. It was really irritating. I couldn't help but slap him. Blake, are you all right?" Keith's calm expression and tone of indifferent superiority made it clear that Blake was nothing more than a mosquito in his eyes. "You dare to hit me?" Blake got a hold of himself and stood up, roaring in rage. "Where are my bodyguards? Where did they go? And all—" But before he could finish his sentence, another blow landed on his face. This time, Keith had hit him even harder. With a sickening crunch, Blake fell to the ground, his face half swollen. Keith looked down at him and sneered. "These mosquitoes are always so damn noisy in the summer. If this one makes any more noise, I'll have to shut it up for good." It was clearly a threat. Blake couldn't believe Keith's behavior. Meanwhile, Christina still stood there quietly, her hands covering her mouth and her eyes wide with disbelief. Just at that moment, 2 burly men came over. They appeared to be Blake's bodyguards as they helped him get up, and one strode towards Keith and punched him. "Let's go," Keith said to himself. He realized that he still had 2 stones in his hand from when he was practicing his throwing skills earlier on, and he suddenly had an idea. His eyes lit up, and he launched the pebbles, one after the other, in the bodyguard's direction. The system's voice piped up. "Ding! Throwing proficiency still activated. Current hit rate is 100%. The announcement was followed by 2 muffled sounds as one of the stones hit a bodyguard right between the eyes, cracking his sunglasses in 2, and the other smacked into the second bodyguard's knee. One of the men staggered towards Keith. Keith was hesitant, but he knew it was the only chance he would get. He bravely took a step forward and punched the bodyguard right in the face. Although Keith's power had reached 10 points by now, this was still only an average score. That meant his punch wasn't that forceful, and it wasn't enough to knock the bodyguard out. The brawny man swayed on the spot for a second, groaning in pain. But with his dexterity at 11 points, Keith was faster than ever before. He swiftly kicked the bodyguard in the stomach, and the man finally crashed to the ground. What the? The other bodyguard was helping Blake off the ground, and his eyes opened wide as he stared at the scene. Before he could get up and react, he saw a foot coming toward his face. Smash! Keith's boot collided with the bodyguard's head, and he fell to the ground unconscious. All of this happened incredibly fast. It couldn't have taken more than 10 seconds. Blake was dumbfounded. His mouth hung open as he stared at the scene in horror. These bodyguards were the best in the business, and yet they'd been defeated so easily. Even Christina stared at Keith in utter shock. She realized that the current Keith was completely different from who he had been back in high school. Her impression of him as a weakling slowly crumbled to dust. Instead, he was starting to look like a domineering and ferocious man in her mind. Keith came toward Blake. Blake was so scared that his legs started to become weak, to the point that he was unable to run or even walk away. He was visibly shaking as he stuttered, "You're not Keith. You can't be. How is this possible?" Keith had a mysterious, mocking smile on his face as he replied, "People change, Blake. I didn't settle my score with you before, and now you're getting more and more out of control." As he walked towards him, his eyes blazed with fury. What do you want?" Blake was truly terrified. "Money? I'll give you money. Please, just don't hurt me." "Money?" Keith sneered. "I don't want your money." His gaze traveled to Christina, who was still standing in a daze. He pointed at her and looked back to Blake. "Christina. Give me Christina, and I'll let you go with no further damage. Otherwise, I'll break your legs." Christina couldn't believe what she was hearing. A shiver ran through her body as she trembled from head to toe. She never would have thought that Keith would make such a request. She turned to Blake slowly. In her heart, she prayed that her boyfriend wouldn't trade her in like a bargaining chip. Blake was shocked too. His eyes traveled from the cold look on Keith's face to the stunned look on Christina's. She looked as if she was about to break down, and Blake paused to think for a moment. But in the end, his fear overcame his dignity, and he gave a single nod. Christina was even more shocked. She looked at Blake and broke down in tears. Keith, however, was happy at his victory. "What kind of monster are you? I was just kidding. But you actually agreed to sell off your girlfriend?" Keith shook his head. "I'm not interested in getting a woman like that. Anyway, I don't want your cast-offs." His words were like arrows, cutting right through Christina's chest. She felt as hurt and sad as if she had just been stabbed by a knife. Just then, the bodyguard that Keith had kicked to the ground earlier stood up. He spun through the air and threw a violent kick at Keith. The system had drastically improved Keith's attributes, but he was still just an ordinary man. Even if he'd reacted in time, it was unlikely that he could stop an attack that strong. With a dull thud, Keith was thrown back against the trunk of a large red maple. This bodyguard was a martial arts master. Even after getting beaten to the ground by Keith, he hadn't actually been knocked out. He had just been lying in wait, waiting for an opportunity to attack when no one was expecting it. When Blake saw this, he got up and laughed arrogantly. "Keith, meet Titan, short for titanium. Well, we call him that because he's unbreakable." Blake laughed again and spat on the ground at Keith's feet. "How dare you humiliate me? You're going to pay for this." Blake turned to Titan. "Finish him. Break his legs. Whatever happens, I'll take the rap." Titan shook his head before nodding at Blake. It looked like he was still a little dizzy from Keith's earlier attack, but he accepted the order and strode forward. Christina was stunned by the sudden reversal of fortunes. She looked at Keith with tears in her eyes, not knowing what to do. Keith lay panting at the base of the tree, heavily injured. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his head. Ding! Injury recovery skill activated. Immediately, the warm current returned to his body and he regained his strength. He opened his eyes and got up, dusting off his clothes as he straightened up. When he looked at Blake, his eyes were filled with murderous intent once more. Blake, did I hear you say that you wanted to finish me?